In 1944, German soldiers were found dead on the battlefield, carrying a British weapon. Not because they had no choice, because they had chosen it. The same weapon their own propaganda had photographed 2 years earlier as proof that Britain was finished. The same weapon their officers had laughed at and called scrap metal. They had chosen to carry it over their own equipment. This video is about why that happened and why it meant Germany had already lost. Cast your mind back to the summer of 1940. Britain has just pulled off the evacuation at Dunkirk. 338,000 men are back on home soil. The newspapers are calling it a miracle. Churchill calls it a deliverance. What nobody is saying out loud, at least not in public, is what was left behind. 90,000 rifles, 2,000 artillery pieces, 7,000 tons of ammunition, hundreds of vehicles. The army had come home. Everything the army needed to fight had not. And German invasion was not a distant possibility. It was, by every intelligence assessment available to the British government, a matter of weeks away. Home Guard units were forming across the country, civilians drilling in fields with weapons from the previous war, being asked to defend their villages and towns against the most battle-hardened military force in Europe. Inside the War Office, someone sat down and wrote a specification for a new submachine gun. What they wrote had never been written in British military history. The weapon had to be cheap, simple enough to build in workshops that had never made weapons, reliable enough to fire when needed. That was the list. Cost first, simplicity second, reliability third. The word quality did not appear. The word finish did not appear. Appearance was not mentioned because Britain in June 1940 could not afford those words. 2 men were handed this problem. Major Reginald Shepherd, an army officer with an engineering background, and Harold Turpin, a designer at the Royal Small Arms Factory at Enfield. Neither was a traditional gunsmith. That turned out to be the most important thing about them. A trained gunsmith carries assumptions: how a military weapon should look, how it should be made, what standard it should meet. Shepherd and Turpin had none of those assumptions. They had a problem, a set of hard constraints, and the pragmatism to solve it without sentiment. The barrel became a steel tube. The receiver became stamped sheet metal welded together. The bolt became a simple block of machined metal. The stock became a wire frame. Total parts, 47. The Thompson submachine gun Britain had been trying to buy from America had over 100 parts. The German MP-40 had 70. Every part Shepherd and Turpin eliminated was an hour of skilled labor removed, a point of potential failure gone, and a fraction of the manufacturing cost saved. They named it after themselves and their factory. Shepherd, Turpin, Enfield. S-T-E-N. Sten. The name was the only elegant thing about it. Here is the number that changed the war. £2. That was the cost to produce one Sten gun. £2 sterling. The Thompson cost the equivalent of £40 at the time. The Sten cost 1/20th as much, and it took 5 hours of labor to build against 70 hours for a Thompson. 5 against 70. That meant a single factory running Sten production could produce 14 weapons in the time it would have taken to produce one Thompson. 14. Multiply that across every factory Britain converted, and the numbers become extraordinary. By 1942, Britain was producing over 500,000 Stens per year. By 1943, over 1 million in a single year. 4 million total by the end of the war. For £8 million sterling in total, less than the cost of some individual warships. German intelligence knew these numbers, and unlike the propaganda being fed to German soldiers about British industrial decline, the analysts understood exactly what 4 million submachine guns meant. It did not mean Britain was desperate. It meant Britain was about to put automatic weapons into the hands of every soldier, every resistance fighter, and every partisan from Norway to Greece. That understanding did not make it into the propaganda. It made it into the classified reports. Now here is something that most people have never heard, and it is one of the stranger facts of the entire Second World War. When the British government began looking for facilities to manufacture Stens at the volume they needed, someone identified a factory in Merton, South London. Before the war, it had been making children's toys, model trains, tin cars, board games. The company was called Triang. Their factory had metal presses, welding equipment, and workers trained to use them. It was, in every practical sense, exactly the kind of facility the Sten had been designed to be built in. So they converted it. The machines that had been pressing out toy trains and tin cars began pressing out Sten receivers and magazines. The workers who had been making Christmas presents for children were now making weapons for the British Army. Every single Mark III Sten gun produced during the war came from that factory, a toy factory, producing military weapons at volume. The Germans were investing enormous resources in precision manufacturing facilities, producing MP40s with 70 carefully machined parts. Britain was answering them from a converted toy workshop in South London. That is not a coincidence or a curiosity. That is the Sten gun in a single image. The soldiers who first received Stens did not see all this. What they saw was the weapon itself, and their reaction was not charitable. British troops trained on Lee Enfield rifles, weapons made with genuine skill and finished with care, looked at the Sten and felt something close to personal insult. It looked like something assembled in a hurry by someone who had never held a real gun. Visible welds, stamped metal, a wire frame where the stock should have been, a magazine jutting out sideways as though the designer had forgotten where it was supposed to go. They called it the stench gun, the plumber's nightmare. Some called it worse things. And the complaints were not purely about appearance. The trigger was dangerously sensitive. There are documented cases of the weapon firing when dropped, when the stock struck a hard surface, when it was handled carelessly in a vehicle. The standard advice was not to carry it with a round chambered, which is a remarkable instruction for a weapon designed for sudden close-quarters combat. The magazine had to be loaded to 28 rounds rather than the full 32 to reduce feeding failures. These were real problems. Some British soldiers died in circumstances where a more reliable weapon might have saved them. That cost was real, and anyone telling the story of the Sten honestly has to say so. But then, in North Africa, something unexpected began to happen. The desert's fine abrasive sand, which seized precision mechanisms and stopped them dead, passed through the Sten's loose tolerances without the same catastrophic effect. Soldiers fighting through Tunisia reported their Stens continuing to function in conditions that had disabled other weapons. It was still ugly, it still misfired occasionally, but it kept working when better-made things had stopped working. Germany had confused quality of manufacture with strategic superiority. The Sten was about to demonstrate, at considerable cost to German forces, exactly why that was a mistake. By 1943, German forces on the Eastern Front were experiencing a kind of attrition that their supply system had not been designed to absorb. Equipment losses were severe, resupply was irregular. A German corporal outside Kharkov, his MP40 stripped for the third time that week trying to clear a jam, picks up a Sten from a dead British liaison officer and fires it once to test it, then pockets it and keeps moving. That decision, made without ceremony in a few seconds of cold calculation, was being made by German soldiers across the entire Eastern Front. They started keeping captured Stens, not as souvenirs, as weapons they intended to use. The 9mm ammunition was identical to what their MP40s used, which meant no separate logistics requirement. The weapon was simple enough to maintain with minimal tools in field conditions, and under the punishment of the Eastern Front, its reliability in adverse conditions was, as German field reports noted with careful understatement, in certain respects superior to their own equipment. Officers who had filed intelligence reports describing the Sten as evidence of British industrial collapse were now carrying them on patrol. The mockery had become something it is very hard to walk back from. It had become respect. And then came the moment that tells you everything. In late 1944, as Allied forces were closing in from west and east, German ordnance engineers were given an urgent requirement: design a weapon for the Volkssturm, the emergency militia Germany was forming from its remaining civilian population. It had to be cheap, simple enough to build in facilities that had never made weapons, producible by semi-skilled labor in large quantities, reliable enough to function under poor maintenance conditions. The engineers sat down. They designed a weapon. They called it the Gerät Potsdam. When you look at its specifications, you are looking at the Sten gun. Not inspired by the Sten gun, not similar to the Sten gun, a copy. Germany collapsed before production could begin. 4 years of mockery, 1 plagiarism.
The resistance. This word appears throughout histories of the Second World War, and it tends to mean something heroic and somewhat abstract. But resistance is also a logistics problem. You cannot fight an occupation with courage alone. You need weapons. And in 1942, weapons were something that underground networks across occupied Europe desperately lacked. Britain's Special Operations Executive recognized almost immediately that the Sten was the answer. It was cheap enough to produce and deliver in quantity while simultaneously equipping British forces. Simple enough that a farmer, a teacher, a shopkeeper with no military training could learn to use and maintain it in an afternoon. Small enough when disassembled to be concealed under floorboards, in haystacks, behind false walls. Reliable enough, under the irregular and often desperate conditions of resistance operations, to keep working without professional maintenance. From 1942 onwards, Stens were being dropped from aircraft across occupied Europe, into fields in northern France, into forests in Poland, along the Norwegian coast, into Belgian suburbs and Greek hillsides. The French resistance received over 100,000 of them before D-Day. The Polish Home Army received tens of thousands. Resistance movements from the Channel to the Adriatic were armed, and that arming had a cost to Germany that far exceeded the £8 million Britain had spent producing the weapons. Every resistance attack on a German supply convoy meant more German soldiers assigned to occupation security instead of frontline duty. Every act of sabotage meant more garrison troops, more military police, more resources diverted from the fronts where Germany needed them. The Sten was tying down hundreds of thousands of German soldiers across an entire continent, at £2 per weapon.
On the 6th of June, 1944, British paratroopers dropped into Normandy before dawn. Many carried Stens as their primary weapons, chosen specifically for the work of those first hours, clearing villages in darkness, securing bridges at close range, fighting in conditions where accuracy at distance was irrelevant and volume of fire at close quarters was everything. Commandos came in from the sea and used Stens to clear fortified positions. Infantry pushed through the bocage, the dense hedgerow country where fields of fire were measured in yards, and found the Sten's limitations irrelevant and its advantages immediate. And then came a moment that no German planner had modelled. British regular forces engaged from the front. French resistance fighters hit the supply lines from behind, both armed with the same weapon, both coordinated, both fighting simultaneously across a front Germany could not seal. on both sides of every German defensive line in Normandy at once. The weapon their propaganda had called scrap metal. In the weeks after D-Day, German soldiers were found dead on Normandy battlefields, carrying Stens, not because they had been disarmed, because they had made a choice. They had looked at a weapon that everyone on their side had assured them was junk, and they had decided to trust what they could see for themselves over what they had been told.